Well, thank you for the excellent questions and discussion we have had so far. In our quest for the land study, we will cover the following events. Abraham enters the promised land, and then he goes to Egypt due to a famine in the land of Canaan. He then returns to the promised land, and God once again covers his promise regarding the land with Abraham. Abraham's son, Isaac, has two sons, Esau and Jacob. And Jacob's son Joseph becomes the governor of Egypt. Now, through the map on this slide, we can follow Abraham's journey to the promised land and his separation from his nephew Lot. God then defines the geography of the promised land to Abraham. God told Abraham to look from the place he stood toward the north, the south, the east, and the west. For all the land that you see will be yours forever. Now, after Abraham had returned to Egypt, he told Isaac that after his death, that all he would have would go to him. Isaac then had two sons, Esau and Jacob. And even though Esau was the firstborn, Jacob became Isaac's promised heir and inherited all of Isaac's possessions at Isaac's death, including the promised land. Now, this promise also included Isaac's direct descendants, who became the 12 Jewish tribes. Well, what happened to Esau? Well, Esau then took a Canaanite wife and became alienated from the Jewish families in much the same manner as Ishmael's fate. Most of Esau's descendants have become followers of the Islamic religion and are enemies of the Jews today. Jacob's youngest son, Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his 11 brothers, ends up in Egypt, and he became the Egyptian Pharaoh's chief governor of the Egyptian kingdom. Now, due to another great famine that occurred in Canaan, Jacob sent his 11 sons to Egypt to buy grain and food for his clan. There they met their brother Joseph, whom they had sold into slavery when Joseph was a young boy, and who is now the chief governor of Egypt. Joseph forgave them of this act and sent them back to Canaan to bring their father and the rest of their father's family to live in Egypt under Joseph's protection. Now, after Joseph died in 1606 BC at the age of 110 years, a new Pharaoh came into power that did not know Joseph, and who had become concerned about the great population of Jews that now lived in Egypt. He worried that the Jews might take over the country, and he took steps to enslave the Jews, who then became builders of Egyptian cities and monuments. In March 1543 BC, Moses was born and was chosen by God to lead the Jewish people out of the Egyptian hard bondage of 80 years. The Jews' journey through the desert wilderness for the Promised Land began on April the 15th, 1462 BC. The journey to the Promised Land took 40 years as God prepared the Jewish people to enter the Promised Land. Moses then died on March the 6th, 1423 BC. He was 120 years old. Then Joshua, not Moses, led the Jewish people into the Promised Land on April the 4th, 1422 BC. Then Joshua, under God's guidance, led the Jewish people to conquer and control the land of Canaan. The land was then divided among the 12 Jewish tribes, and the Old Testament Jewish nation came to an end in 586 BC through the defeat of Israel during the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities. The Romans then drove the Jews out of Israel in 70 AD, and the final remnant of Jews were dispersed across the world in 135 AD, again by the Romans. Now, the Jews remained scattered throughout the world from 70 AD to 1948 AD because of their continued disobedience to God. However, as promised in Ezekiel chapter 37, God has allowed the Jews to return to the Promised Land and once again become a nation. This happened on May the 14th, 1948. Now, while the Jews currently control that part of the Promised Land they occupy, they will not totally live in the land set forth in the royal grant until the millennium. Now, this concludes part 1 of our 4-part study. And before we move on to part 2 and the study of the Islamic solution and how the British set up the Middle East crisis, Israel's return to the disputed land, and the birth of the Palestine Liberation Organization, do we have any questions?